Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm impressed by how many of you have made it out on a Saturday morning, but we have such a fantastic panel. I'm actually not surprised at all that you are here with us. So we have two speakers here with us in the room and two joining us online. My name is Isha Nelson. I'm a business and economics reporter for the New York Times based in London. I'll be moderating this panel all about resource security and scarcity in a time of crisis. So with me in the room, I have President Felipe Calderón, the former president of Mexico, who will be here to talk to us about his work also with the World Resource Institute and other international bodies. Sir David King, who will be joining us from his work at the University of Cambridge, where he is the chair of the Center for Climate Repair. And then on the screen, we have Susan Chomba, the Director for Vital Landscapes for Africa at the World Resources Institute, and Cassie Flynn, who is the Head of Climate Strategies and Policies for the United Nations Development Programme. Now, I would love to be able to take lots and lots of questions today in the end of this session, so I want you to start thinking about them early, because I want this to be a really engaged and lively session, so you've had plenty of warning. So to start with, I think I'll get our people on the screen joining us just to take 1 minute each to introduce themselves and their work so that we know where everyone is kind of coming from and what their interest in resource security is. So Cassie, can I ask you to start? Ooh. Can I ask someone to unmute Cassie so she can start? Still no luck. I'm going to maybe see if we can move to Susan.
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Excellent. It's a big pleasure to be here. My name is Dr. Susan Chomba. I'm the Director for Vital Landscapes at World Resources Institute based in Nairobi, and also one of the ambassadors for the UN High-Level Champions on Climate Change. And so my work really cuts across food systems transitions, forest protection and nature protection, as well as securing the rights of indigenous communities in Africa. So briefly, that's my background.
Perfect. President Calderon, would like to go next?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Felipe Calderón, former president of Mexico, and honorary chairman of the Global Commissions on the Economy and Climate. We created the new climate economy concept. Currently working, creating a global center for sustainable tourism with very good friends here. So, and a fighter still for a better world.
Lovely. Let's give another go. Cassie, can we hear you now?
Yes, I can hear you. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can.
Cassie Flynn, it's such a pleasure to be here with all of these climate fighters on stage and in the audience and online. I lead something called the Climate Promise, which is the world's largest support for countries under the Paris Agreement, supporting well over 120 countries with their pledges and how they're going to implement them. So pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And Sir Dave, I'd like you to go next. And I think you had some slides you wanted to share with us just to start us off thinking about the scope of the resources we need to be thinking about in this conversation.
I've been heavily engaged in the political sphere, although I'm a chemical physicist from the University of Cambridge originally, and was chief scientific advisor with Tony Blair, and then stayed on with both Cameron and May, where I was based in the Foreign Office leading the climate negotiations. I met Felipe on several occasions while he was president, and we, I think, made some real progress at that time. What I want to say now is we agreed in Paris that we should not exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. That is not good enough. So that's my message. We're now at 1.35 to 1.4 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. And even if we were to stop at this point, I'm going to say not good enough. Why? Up in the Arctic Circle region, we've been losing ice far more rapidly over the Arctic Ocean during the polar summer up there than any of us climate scientists predicted. And so what is happening now during the polar summer, more than 50% of the Arctic Sea, that blue sea, is now exposed to sunlight. And of course, during the midsummer period at the North Pole, that's 24 hours a day. The result is that the temperature rise over the Arctic Circle region is now 3.5 degrees centigrade on average above the pre-industrial level, and it's climbing at 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. Now, why is that a critical factor for humanity? I need a few seconds to explain this. First of all, if we've got a cold Arctic, as we've always had for hundreds of thousands of years, we end up with this jet stream, an anti-clockwise wind blowing around the North Pole, which separates the cold air in the Arctic region from the warm air from the tropics. And you see that labeled L and H in the diagram on the left-hand side here. What is now happening is illustrated on the right-hand side. The warm Arctic means the air above that blue sea warms up extremely rapidly. I must tell you that yesterday I had a call from a climate scientist who lives up in north of Finland. He's a member of the Sami people, Tero Mustonen, and he's a representative on the Climate Crisis Advisory Group that I chair. And he told me the temperature where he is living on the permafrost was 32.5 degrees centigrade, plus 32.5 degrees centigrade. Now, if ever there was a warning to humanity, there it is. So what we're seeing, therefore, is a series of consequences that we're already experiencing and we've been experiencing for the last 3 or 4 years. Let me take you to so you see the distortion in that wind, the jet stream, resulting from cold air being pushed down, L, down southwards, but then warm air comes up from the tropics to replace the cold air. It's a completely new climate system emerging. And on the right, next slide, I think I'm the one in charge. Right. Yes. We see the massive distortion in the jet stream that occurred last summer. So the Climate Crisis Advisory Group got hold of this data from the official meteorological office in the United States, but this was true right around the Northern Hemisphere. So what happens here? In Central America, Canada and America, the cold air coming sweeping down, being pushed by that low-density warm air over the Arctic, means that cold air has swept down, and as a result, hot air comes up from the equatorial region. And so if you were wondering why Lytton in British Columbia suffered a temperature rise of 49.9 degrees centigrade, it's because this jet stream along the west coast of America got locked into the position shown here. And it was locked in like that for about 3 weeks. Lytton, a very upper middle class town, 135 people died of heat stress. Why? Because there's very little air conditioning in Canada. It's cold enough that you don't need air conditioning. And in the central of America, we all know that Texas experienced temperatures of minus 16 degrees centigrade. So what you've got is this big contrast. And on the east coast of America, dreadful storms. Where this jet stream has not been before, we see a complete upset in the weather systems of the world. This, I have to emphasize, is just the beginning. Next slide.
Yeah, let's do one last slide because this is thoroughly, I'm sure, traumatizing everyone.
All right, but this is just me summarizing here. This is why what is happening at the North Pole impacts on the whole world, food security, everything. Next to that blue sea you see on the left-hand side there, the Arctic Sea, during the polar summer, Greenland ice is now melting irreversibly. What does that mean? 6.5 meters of sea level rise when all of that ice has entered the ocean. Average for the whole planet. Not one global city sitting on coastlines will survive even a couple of meters, which is pretty sure by the end of this century. And on the right-hand side, in the permafrost, there's a vast amount of methane trapped as methane hydrates. And as that warms up, there's explosive release now happening of methane. There's enough methane there. If it was all released quickly, temperatures globally would rise by 5 to 8 degrees centigrade. You know, this is end game.
Yeah, I feel like you've really shared with us the severity and the speed at which these problems need to be addressed and the urgency of this conversation we're having now. And I don't know if I'm going to bring in our other speakers, because this is, we have plenty to talk about, and I know our speakers on screen will also want to talk about that impact on
Can I just
food and
say, Nick,
agriculture.
I hate giving the terrible story without giving the solutions. But
Well, I think as we go, we must hear the solutions. Absolutely, we can't just leave it on that note of what. That's a little cliffhanger for what's to come. President Calderon, you hosted COP16 in Cancun. I mean, a lot of us here would have been at COP26 and very engaged. And as Sir Dave said, this commitment to 1.5, which we're hearing, is not strong enough. But what has changed in the past 10 years that is around this conversation of resource security? How are we thinking about it now?
One is there is a growing interest and massive support in one side of the society to take action immediately. And the call for action is coming, fortunately, coming with the next generations, with all of you and all the people interested in fighting climate change and take responsibility. That has changed. The other thing has changed is the multilateralism start to react. And actually, you remember Copenhagen meeting in 2009 was a terrible failure, and we all believed that there was no way to get any coming from multilateral agreements. And finally, in Cancun, we found a way to recover that part, to get consensus, to actually, it was when the unilateral commitment were established, the precedent and foundation for NDCs. That was the key success in Paris afterwards. But those unilateral commitments started in Cancun. So I can see a new moment and a new narrative that we contributed probably with David and others in the New Climate Economy Project, in the which that it is not only about these messages related to the apocalyptic consequences of climate change that we need to talk, because in my political experience, very few people move by fears. So people can be moved by hope, and instead, not only to talking about the horrible consequences of hell, we need to talk about the promise of the promised land and in heaven. And the heaven is to have a different world, more responsible. What are the things that are not changing since then? That a lot of political decisions are moved either by ego and profits. The war in Ukraine is moved by ego and profits, I believe. And the decision of the Supreme Court in the United States was moved exactly by ego and profits as well.
You mean the recent EPA decision?
Yeah, well, I'm very bad with acronyms in English. I hate that. But I'm talking about the reference about the canceling the American Agency for Energy, its attributes, in order to establish stopping coal power generation and all stuff. So why? Because vested political interests always are deterring action. So that's the thing that's continue, and that is the thing we need to talk today, but also the consequences now. The war, the invasion, Russian invasion on Ukraine, which is unspeakable, horrible, stupid thing, is transforming and is creating a chaos now, rising up prices of energy, in oil, natural gas. Russia is the main exporter of oil, the main exporter of natural gas in the world. Europe is depending 45% of natural gas coming from Russia. And that is speaking up the prices everywhere, not only for oil, not only for gas, but also for electricity. And causing this terrible cost of living crisis that we are facing everywhere. And with addition, with the extreme events that David was talking about, the increases in food prices everywhere are going to throw out millions of people, or hundreds of millions of people, to misery again. So what we are facing is a new dramatic crisis in food prices, energy prices. And is there any chance for the promised land we want to talk about? I'm very skeptical after listening, David, that you were saying. But there is a chance if we can use this moment of opportunity of high prices of energy to foster transition to renewable energy, to foster transition to safe energy. What is the problem? Politicians and governments are suffering a terrible pressure on those living crisis, or the price of food, so the price of energy for all. It is possible that good people in government trying to act responsibly can be defeated in elections due to the energy prices. And they are calling for the very reverted impact. For instance, not only pushing for energy transition for renewables, but also calling from coal power generation again. Italy, the UK, Germany are announcing to power generation through coal again. And that is going to happen in Asia, which its fleet of coal power generation is quite young. So we are having a very difficult moment, and I hope we can push with the right messages and the right political pressure in order to put and try again a renewable or an energy transition and all the way in the right track for a new climate economy.
Let me ask you a follow-up question real quick, which is just, do you think that in the past there has been a slightly too lax attitude towards energy security and independence, or actually do you think there should be cooperation, it just needs to be underpinned by better multinational agreements?
Well, honestly, I believe that Europe could take this decision since several years ago, more than that, because it's not about Ukraine, it is not about Crimea. It was actually in 2008, Russia invaded another country, and Europe was conscious about these dangers and the high dependency on Russian oil and natural gas, and Europe did nothing, basically. And if the decision could be taken then, in order to foster a renewable energy transition in Europe, in order to stop dependency on Russia, since 10 years ago, probably today, Europe could be independent and full renewable. And it is not happening. Now, with this new plan, what is the energy? I mean, I have my notes here, too, which is the energy, the European Repowering EU. I hate the acronym.
Repower EU, yeah.
Repowering
Well, the EU is full of acronyms.
For 2027, it's a big opportunity. But I regret always the time has been lost, but forget about that. No, we have a new chance. I hope Europe could be success in repowering EU, and they say it's a big opportunity for renewable energy and a transition to hydrogen, but at the same time, we cannot ignore that there will be a setback towards coal power generation and nuclear. My advice, and maybe politically completely incorrect, don't push too much the leaders that are responsible. But you can get even a worse leader if you push too much. No? So yes, you can have a lot. Look what is happening in the United States. Politics is going to be about
spoken
energy
like
prices.
A true politician, President Calderon.
True politician, wow. We will talk about, you need to be the politicians. Don't finger point politicians anymore. You need to be the politician. Yeah, stop saying the political party is the leader. You need to be the new political party. Stop to do that. And I stop with this.
Cassie, you help countries implement agreements. Can you tell us if they are staying committed? And I'm curious whether this reversion to coal that we're seeing in the middle of the crisis in Europe is going to reduce the credibility Europe and other advanced economies have in trying to push other countries to take part in these agreements too, in this narrative that actually we all must move together, and lots of countries obviously feel they're going to get left behind in this transition.
Well, I think that countries are really grappling right now with the fact that we have, as Sir King and President Calderon mentioned, we've changed life on Earth as we know it. And if you were to ask me what the new normal is, it's instability. Instability is the new normal. And we're seeing countries all around the world try to grapple with this. And I think where the tension is we have a short-term immediate need with these increased energy prices, with shocks to the food system, not to mention the COVID pandemic, which so many countries are still grappling with. That now, how do they manage that with a long-term viewpoint? And we're seeing some countries really just start to backtrack on that long-term viewpoint, to be honest, that we're seeing countries that had put very ambitious climate pledges forward, now as they're faced with these short-term needs, starting to change what they're doing with fossil fuels, starting to change what they're doing with their energy systems. And I think that the real problem that we're facing is that countries are not seeing this as a package, that we don't have to choose between solving the energy crisis, solving the food crisis, and solving the climate crisis. That actually these can be put together if we start merging together this immediate need and this long-term need. And we're starting to see some countries do this, and some countries in unexpected places. These countries that have been facing some of these immediate needs and some of these and need to build these long-term goals and build long-term systems. We're seeing countries really start to push this forward. In particular, small island states, least developed countries. When it comes to the Paris Agreement and the pledges that were put under the Paris Agreement, it was these small islands and these least developed countries that were by far the most ambitious. And they're continuing to be the most ambitious.
Maybe you can share with us an example of one of these countries that we should be looking at for this ambitious work.
Yeah, there's actually there's a number of them. So for example, Antigua and Barbuda, they want to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. Chile has talked about how you can engage local communities in new efforts to advance a circular economy. Uruguay, 97% of the electricity already comes from renewable resources. We're seeing countries start to take these bold moves, but right now, with what's going on with these immediate crises, they're facing severe headwinds. And that's where the challenge is. And this is where, as a global community, we have to get beyond sort of thinking as sort of my country first, and instead start supporting each other with these big goals. Because it's when we start having countries saying, oh, we're just worrying about ourselves, is when we start to see all of us lose.
Thank you. So, Dave, do you want to respond to that? You promised us some solutions there, but is this focus on energy security that we're seeing now, is that helping or hindering the green transition? It feels like it could really go either way.
What we must not ignore is the power of the fossil fuel lobby in the United States and how that has distorted the democratic system massively. So I just can't emphasize this too much. They've been putting up to $1 billion a year into their campaign to denigrate climate scientists. It's just quite astonishing. And the result is now this latest Supreme Court ruling. But this is just part of the pattern. Why?
So Dave, do you mind taking a moment just to explain this ruling? I think it happened so recently, I don't know that everyone in the room will be aware of it.
The Supreme Court has now ruled that the Environmental Protection Agency cannot rule against coal, oil, and gas burning in the United States. And this ruling applies to every state in the United States, and it really just puts the sledgehammer on so many efforts in the United States. But what I do want to say is, in the negotiations, and I've been vitally concerned with those, we've never had leadership from the United States. The President of the United States, even Obama, had his hands tied by his Congress and Senate because they have their hands tied by the fossil fuel lobbies. I don't think we should ignore this. Now, you said to me, what is the positive thing I've got to say? The Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge is saying 3 things. We need deep and rapid emissions reduction in an orderly and a fair fashion. That means the developed countries need to stand up and deliver the money they've been promising for the past 12 years to the developing world and the developed world. We promised $100 billion. It's never exceeded $21 billion. Now G7 have just repeated that they will see that it's funded. Let's see the money first. But the second, deep and rapid emissions reduction, number one. The second, too much in the way of greenhouse gases up there. If we count methane, and methane is now contributing as much to global warming as carbon dioxide, emissions are rising so rapidly. If we count all of that together, we're over 500 parts per million. The pre-industrial period was 265. Right, so we're nearly doubling the pre-industrial level. It's like putting another duvet on your bed at night when you are warm enough. You are going to get really hot. So I think the second thing is we are learning how we can remove greenhouse gases at scale. We have to bring the level down from 500 plus to 350. I believe we can do it with willing and with funding and with the support of the developed countries funding this. The third part of this is refreeze the Arctic. Now that sounds like a big challenge, but I can tell you that we're making a lot of progress with a big international consortium on this. Refreezing the Arctic means keeping the sun off the ice that's formed during the winter for the 3 summer months over the Arctic Sea. We might be able to do it, but it'll take us 5 years to sort the technology out.
So you're talking about geoengineering, or not?
I never call it geoengineering.
Well, it's time to talk openly about.
Yes, no, this is biomimicry. Biomimicry. We're imitating.
Yes, let's explain what that means for those of us who aren't.
Imitating natural processes. How do white clouds form in the sky over the sea? When there's a storm at sea, tiny droplets of water are formed, picked up by the upward lift of the air when the sea is warm, and you end up with a white cloud. So we are making progress on creating white cloud cover around the Arctic Circle region and seeing that we only activate those that take the clouds over the Arctic Circle.
I hope there's some scientists in the room with some follow-up questions to this concept, because I'm an economics journalist, but I want to know what people think.
Good question.
I would like. Do you want to just?
Yeah, but I think we.
Dr. Susan Chomba, because I was this figure was shared with me, and I'm going to also share some startling statistics. So, according to the World Food Programme, the number of people facing acute food insecurity more than tripled between 2017 and 2021, and could further increase by 17% to 323 million this year as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. Dr. Chomba, we started talking about the climate and the impact on of weather on food systems. I mean, can you tell us where there has been progress, but also the strains? I know one of the things you mentioned in the past is how when you are pushed to use other natural ecosystems for agriculture because the other places you want to use are destroyed by drought, etc., there's kind of perpetual problems.
Thank you so much. And first, I think the idea that food systems would experience extreme pressure from a changing climate is not new. Even the IPCC working group report that was released earlier this year was very clear that food production is already lower than it would have been without climate change. We are seeing productivity down by 21% of crops and at least by 4% for fisheries. And these kind of statistics have also been very, very well elaborated in terms of the geographical significance. So regions in the world that were expected to experience significant decrease in productivity as a result of climate change. And those regions, especially in the tropics, especially regions like Africa, are very, very well known that they would be adversely affected. Now, that's the theory, that's the projections, that's the science. And in reality now, we are living it on the African continent. As you asked, right now in the Horn of Africa, at least 20 million people are facing acute food shortage and some even starvation. So it's really, really serious. These are countries in a country like mine, Kenya, in the northern part of Kenya. You have countries like Somalia, you have Southern Sudan, you have parts of Ethiopia. And really this Horn of Africa has been experiencing not just the effects of climate change, seeing increases in terms of drought intensity and the frequencies of droughts have really increased in the last decade, but also the effect, as David mentioned in the beginning, of the climate, of the war in Ukraine. We are seeing the war in Ukraine really having significant effect on food prices, but also the prices of fertilizer. So farmers are not able to afford fertilizers because the cost of fertilizer has doubled or even tripled in some countries. And then we are seeing the prices of commodities such as wheat. Some countries in Africa depend very, very highly on wheat imports from Ukraine and from Russia. And so this is a complex set of challenges that has produced food insecurity currently, and really looking at people facing a lot of starvation and other challenges. It is the food system is complex, and it's very much related to nature, as you're saying. You know, when local communities they cannot be able to produce on the current pieces of land, either because it's completely affected by drought, or the soil is depleted because of unsustainable land management practices. We are seeing extensification of agricultural lands into protected areas. So for instance, in the Congo Basin, one of the key things that we are seeing currently is increasing of areas that are for producing food into the natural ecosystems, into one of the biggest reservoirs of carbon and biodiversity that we have in the world after Amazon. So the Congo Basin basically is now under pressure, both from climate change, but also from human activities. And so it's a complex set of issues here that we are trying to deal with. But I want to mention that there's a lot that is going on in terms of what we can do in terms of addressing the food crisis. First of all, we need to look inwards, looking at ways of creating resilient food systems and ways of addressing the current humanitarian crisis. I think also President Philippe mentioned there in the beginning that about the funds that have been promised to developing countries for adaptation. 100 billion were promised every year back in 2009. very little is coming to the developing countries. And these are funds that can really alleviate the current crisis in terms of food, but also other aspects of adaptation that are required. And secondly, it's looking at long-term strategies for addressing resilient food systems. And in this case, we need to start transitioning, just like we have energy transitions. We need to look at food systems transitions so that our food production is less dependent, first of all, on climatic conditions. So really looking at irrigation systems and working towards more sustainable production systems, ensuring that we have enough water for irrigation. So we have to look at both management of natural ecosystems as well as the way food is produced. And secondly, is to look at bolstering for soil health so that we are not just dependent on synthetic fertilizers in the long term that are mainly fossil fuel. They're coming from the fossil fuels, but looking at how do we build more healthy and sustainable soils through other natural systems that can be used to produce food sustainably. So there is hope. There are systems that can be put in place, but right now there's still challenges that we are facing before we get to that point.
Dr. Chumba, I wanted to ask you to go back to your point on the adaptation, the financing for adaptation, because as you said, that commitment, the amount that has been committed hasn't changed for years, but neither has the amount that is actually being received. I mean, do you have thoughts on what is causing so much of the holdup, and particular projects and ideas that the money can go towards that could help speed this process up? I think sometimes there is a sense it's like, well, these projects are risky, we don't know where we should put them, and I feel like a lot of excuses. Your thoughts on what needs to be done to speed up the distribution of these funds?
Well, first of all, the funds are promised by developed countries to developing countries, and it is not just something that is. It's about justice in climate change. It's about looking at most of the people that are suffering in the developing countries had very little historically, as well as at the present time, in terms of contributing to climate change. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, historically, the emissions have been at least 4% of global greenhouse gases. And most of it is actually coming from South Africa and part of it from Northern. So sub-Saharan Africa contributes insignificant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And so for these communities to be suffering the most, it's an issue of justice, it's an issue of loss and damage. So that's the first point. And so these funds trying to claim that there are no places that can be invested, there are so many channels. So for instance, we are working around in Africa around Africa Forest Restoration Initiative, AFR 100, which is a massive ambition to restore at least 100 million hectares on the continent. If we restore those millions of hectares, of course, there will be significant amounts of carbon that will be sequestered. Now, remember, Africa doesn't have the burden of sequestering carbon because historically, there's been very little in terms of emissions. But we want to do it so that it's resilient. We are having resilient development pathways. And so there are different ways that these funds can be invested under AFR 100. For instance, $2 billion can go into such a program. There are structures, there are institutions that are working together with governments, together with AU, together with international organizations, reaching even the very local communities. And those are some of the areas that can be invested in terms of this finance to help build the food system productions as well as sequester carbon and look at issues of justice and in climate change. Secondly, there are NDCs that African governments have prepared, and some of these NDCs have got very, very clear pathways that can be funded and can be able to help both in terms of adaptation, but also contribute to mitigation, honestly. And so there are ways that these funds can really help us adapt and both mitigate to climate change. And I think the excuses that are being given about projects not being sensible or secure are just excuses. There are a lot of areas that can be invested effectively and efficiently.
We are almost ready to move to audience questions, so start thinking. But before I do, I just have a question I want each of my panelists to answer really quickly, which is, what can governments do to lead a just transition and one that isn't kind of tilted in favor of rich countries? President Felipe.
Well, several things. One, but before that is, I know I support all the things that say that the governments are not delivering their promises regarding money and a lot of things. But we need to be careful about what is happening. What Sir David said is what is happening. We are losing the refrigerator of the world. We are losing the freezer, and that is going to increase dramatically the catastrophes. We need to stop that process, and for me, is that we are in a plane, that the plane is going to have a crash, and we are fighting between junkie class, again business class, and everybody fighting inside. We need to save, to get a pilot and to fix the way. Yeah, well, now, what the governments can do for a fair transition, well, we need to understand what is a just transition. It's going to be easier to have a fair transition if we have the right projects, because it is not just give me the money. For what? And to who? Because the perception in a lot of developed countries is a lot of corrupt people leading some countries, getting the money and disappearing the money, and coming to London with a massive fortunes to spend, with the leaders and a lot of scores.
Yes.
And so we need to think about it. One way to make a fair transition is to design the right project. So as you were saying about forestry, and WRI, I had the honor to be a member of the board 9 years recently, has a beautiful programs to rainforest protection, to forest watch, surveillance, a lot of things. We need to commit in programs that actually have traction and could be applied on the field, action on the field. If we are able to develop programs with actually, you can demonstrate, the Minister of Finance of any country, I'm not defending them, that this program actually works. It's sequestrating X tons of carbon per year. It's having a real traction because the right people is conducting that. That's going to be completely different to say, just give it 20 million people to that government, which is incredibly corrupt. Second, 1 point.
We'll get to Cassie soon. Cassie's going to be next.
Right, okay.
Well, yeah.
But we give
you'll have a chance
keep
to
one stall.
Yeah.
One lot for me at the end.
Cassie.
Well, building on that, when it comes to a just transition, we have to make sure it is embedded in every single thing we do when it comes to the recovery from all of these crises, when it comes to that long-term thinking, when it comes to fulfilling our pledges under the Paris Agreement. How we ensure that no one is left behind is going to completely shape how successful we are when it comes to fighting this crisis. And that includes everything we've talked about with energy and green jobs and agriculture and all of the ways that we have to ensure that local communities are empowered. But also going back to this finance question, ensuring that access to finance is equitable, is efficient, and can reach these communities is so critical. Because even now, and we talk about being able to meet the need in Africa, of the $2.8 trillion that have been invested in renewable energy in the world over the last 20 years, 2% has gone to Africa, 2%. And the choices that Africa makes right now are going to absolutely influence the global economy, going to absolutely influence how we can achieve the Paris Agreement. And this is where we need to focus. And this issue of justice is going to be critical throughout all of this. We have to achieve the goals that we set out in the Paris Agreement. These nationally determined contributions, they are the tool. They are where countries will be accountable to the global system. We have to invest in them. Countries have put a lot of effort into making sure they have adequate energy targets and agriculture targets, adaptation targets. They talk about loss and damage. We have to invest in them. If we don't invest in them, it is such, not only putting us further on the precipice that we have heard, but also it is such a missed opportunity. Because if we can reshape the global economy, if we can transform it in the way that we know how, we can not only address these immediate shocks of the pandemic, energy and nature crisis and food prices, but also help to put in place the long-term transformation that we need.
So Dave, this question on the just transition and how we can make sure that it succeeds and isn't,
Let me start by putting a question on what is the cost of making a just transition? And what is the cost of not making a just transition? I've talked about extreme weather events being driven by what is now happening due to climate change. Extreme weather events last year, total loss and damage, including insurance losses and so on, will well exceed $500 billion, maybe $1 trillion. Right? That's the losses in 1 year, and this can only get worse. So what I'm saying is, we need to look very carefully at our balance of funding, because if we don't fund a just transition, then frankly, this is all only going to get a whole lot worse. Managing a just transition is, for me, an enormous challenge. if you go to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings, you may not know that the average number of negotiators per country is 20. You multiply 20 by 5, by how many nations in the world?
120.
175.
For the Soccer World Cup are much more, but anyway.
Has anyone got a calculator out?
We're talking about... We're talking about 4,000 people trying to negotiate in one place an agreement, and you're wondering why it's taken so long to get an agreement. So what we need is a much more nimble body of willing nations. I'm no longer going to believe we can take 190 nations with us.
200 plus.
We could make do with 25 nations, but we also need to bring into that discussion, for example, indigenous people. We need to see there's a representative there. We need a high-level discussion amongst the wealthiest countries of the world and the poorest countries of the world and those in between. I don't want to see more than 25 people around this table, right? So it's got to be something very efficient. If you're wondering whether there's a model for this, it could begin with the G20.
Okay, let's. I'm going to just ask Dr. Susan to answer that question, and then we're going to take some audience questions.
I want to say something.
But first, Dr. Susan's thought on the just transition and how for that to succeed.
Well, just transitions will have to take into consideration our histories and where we are coming from. And I think that's the key point, that countries that have traditionally had very little in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are the ones who are suffering the most. It is very crucial, therefore, that we understand adaptation finance is not a gift. It's not something that we are doing developing countries or countries that are worse affected a favor. It is something that should be considered as part of justice. And so, as we're saying, in terms of looking forward, these funds need to be really, realized and released to these communities very, very urgently. And secondly, I'd like to emphasize the point that Cassie mentioned about the equity in the whole. It's not everybody in developing countries that is affected in the same way. We need to think about the effect of climate change on women, the gender dimension. Women are the most affected in rural areas. They are the ones who are constantly trying to ensure that the society is moving, they are producing food for their communities, but also on the other hand, really receiving very little in terms of democratic space, receiving very little in terms of financing. And so just transition needs to look even beyond just the dimension of rich and poor countries. It's divisions within those countries. It's understanding the effect on indigenous and local communities, the dimension of women and youth and how they are affected by climate change. Now, I like to look at the point of hope and look at what these communities are already doing, and especially women. There are so many programs that I come across where women in rural Africa are really, sort of on the driveway towards food systems transitions, towards investing in sustainable land management practices, towards investing in driving rural economies, but they are receiving very, very little support to be able to move that. So for me, just transition is ensuring that those people who are at the forefront of actually ensuring, even if they are most affected, even if they did very little to contribute, they are at the forefront of innovation and bringing food to our tables that is produced sustainably. Those are the communities that should be targeting of people. And when I talk about communities, I'm talking about communities of women, communities of youth, communities of indigenous people need to be really supported.
Thank you. Okay, we could keep talking amongst ourselves for hours, but I want to get some audience thoughts and questions. Let's keep them really quick. There will be microphones coming around, so please be sure to wait for the microphone. So we have one question here, and then we'll take two more over here, and then we will...
Yep, hello. Well, thank you so much for the views. We've heard a lot of top-bottom approaches to climate change. I would like to hear a little bit more from the panelists about how we drive behavior change and bottom-up approaches when in regards to energy, food supply, and other supply chains.
So we had a question in the middle somewhere here. Who was that? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's really interesting topics, and I want to just take a step back and ask. So in the 1950s, there was no cure to childhood leukemia until one gentleman in Chicago made a decision and took away everything that was known in the past and walked forward and said, you know what, the smartest people need to be at the table making the decisions for the whole world. You can't do it by everybody getting together. And childhood leukemia was solved in about 7 years, completely. So David, you mentioned that geomimicry is the way that you can change the basic premise of what's happening in this world, which is to change the temperature by the smart people designing a new world that we can now live in and not wait for everybody else. Who's leading that charge? How much money is going against it? Who's modeling it to see what is needed? And who genuinely is the person that's going to stand up and take the initiative to stop everybody else arguing and get to the fundamental fact of changing the climate that we need to do to save the world?
Thank you. Okay, we have 3 in this corner. Let's, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. This is another science-based question to you, Sir David. I'm not a scientist, so this may be a very, very basic question for you, but I was wondering about the interplay between seeding these, I'm guessing it's cumulus clouds.
Sorry, what?
Sorry?
What did you say?
For creating these cumulus clouds that will protect the Arctic, what's the interplay between, I guess, increasing the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere to create these clouds and then balancing it between the effect of the warming effect that extra water vapor has in the atmosphere?
Great, and then question behind you.
Hello. So, Sir David, you mentioned a really important point about the power of capitalist interests in impeding climate change. And it really does feel like the greatest obstacle is not the lack of ideas to fund, but actual capitalist interest as an obstacle to promoting large-scale climate change. And even at points in this conference, it felt like climate change solutions are only actionable if there is a profit to be made from it. So how do we destabilize, disempower capitalist interests to actually promote the climate change needed quickly?
Okay, I'm going to take the last 3 hands that I saw. So one here, and then they're on the other side.
Thank you very much. Sir David, again, this is a question somewhat directed in your direction. Just to give you an easy time this morning, lots of easy questions. Really struck by the fact that 2 of the 3 potential solutions you speak of are premised upon science, which is, let's say, developing rather than developed and you know, at a scalable point. My fundamental question is, how do we, and this is somewhat of a reflection of the last question, how do we de-link or decouple, such as we experienced during COVID, consumption from climate change? So we've seen the massive falls that took place during the COVID period. Essentially, the first of the solutions you spoke about talk about turning the lights off, reducing consumption immediately. How can we get that decoupled from economic gain?
Thank you. And the other question's on the side, and I've done a really annoying thing by keeping hold of this handheld mic, so my poor colleague has to run across the room. So here, and then to the lady just there.
I'm Jeff Lippman, and I'm here with the Sustainable Tourism Global Center and the President Calderon Fan Club. And I have a question for our friend from Kenya, and I guess it also applies to all the panelists. How do you move from the generalizations to the specifics? At the start of your presentation, you said, if we get the 100 billion a year which has been promised and hasn't been delivered, we can deal with the problem. And the question is, can you deal with the problem as it's now being reframed in real terms around us by the war in Ukraine and the pressure on the economy and the pressure on food systems? Is $100 billion a year provided? Will that be enough, or do you need more? And if you need more, how much more will you need?
Thank you. And then our last question. Thank you.
I'll be very quick. Permafrost in Siberia. How do we deal with this issue, given that we are sanctioning Russia and ostracizing Russia? Keeps me up at night.
How do we deal with the permafrost in Siberia, given that we are sanctioning Russia and it's being kind of cut off from international relations? Okay, we are practically out of time, but we had so many really fantastic questions, and I'm going to ask Sir Dave to start because a lot of them were for him. I mean, feel free to go in as little detail as possible and to catch up with people in the break that's coming, because I would like everyone to have a final word. Sir Dave.
So let me run very quickly through those I can deal with quickly. Cloud cover isn't going to increase humidity at all. So basically that humidity is determined by the ocean surface temperature. Doesn't matter what we do in terms of cloud cover. The power of capitalist interests, I don't think I can quite manage that one. It's quite
a big question, but thank you for raising it.
But the two or three potential solutions that I was talking about, how do we decouple consumption from climate change? It's very similar to the first one. I think it is critically important to understand the International Energy Agency came through with a 10-point action plan to deal with the problem in Europe that President Calderon was referring to, and the problem arises because of the dependence on gas supplies from Russia into Europe. And that 10-point plan is a very cogent plan which does not lean on fossil fuels at all, right? So it's to avoid the use of fossil fuels. Let me just say something about that. If a government, and I fear my government is doing this, if a government says to the oil companies, we're going to subsidize you to find more oil in the North Sea, how long will it take before the oil becomes available? And the answer is at least 10 years, it might be 20. It's completely outside the time scale of what we're talking about here. And I believe that is the power of the fossil fuel lobby coming through again to persuade governments under the pretext of this war that they should now be funded even more than before. So I think we really need to understand what is happening here. I think the question about the biomimicry and the smart world, I mean, I do want to say biomimicry has a real meaning to me, which is simply using natural processes and then augmenting them in a way that will support the changes we need to make. And one example is how white cloud cover is created. That is just mimicking the way white clouds already are created, but we can generate clouds in a position that will take them over the North Pole. So every piece of what we're doing. I want to say one more thing, if I may.
And then we're going to go to Cassie for her thoughts.
Which is, how are we going to remove greenhouse gases at scale? And we've got quite an advanced global consortium working on something called marine biomass restoration. How are we going to do that? We're going to mimic the behavior of whales. We removed whales through capturing them for their blubber over the last 400 years. What's the function of the whales? They eat 300 to 500 meters below sea level. When they come up, of course they have to breathe, we see that. And we've only recently understood when you're 300 meters below sea level, all your orifices are jammed shut. They come up and they do something else. They poop in the surface of the ocean. And this brings fertile material into the sunlit area of the ocean. Within 3 days, that whole area, maybe 1,000 square kilometers, is covered with phytoplankton. And within 2 months, you've got perhaps 500 million fish in that area. Right, so that's what we're aiming to mimic. You take up maybe 4 to 10 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year using the oceans, the deep oceans of the world, and you return the whales, and then we let the whales carry on doing it.
Cassie, just a few thoughts really quickly.
Three thoughts from my end. I think that one of the things that we know, and I think this discussion really has reflected this, is we do know how to solve this problem. The money exists to solve this problem. What we have a lack of is the political will. What we have a lack of is the commitment by every country in the world to actually do what it takes. The second thing I want to talk about is transformation. And this tension that we have between countries trying to grapple with the short-term needs with that long-term perspective, I think is the hurdle that we have to get over. And when we talk about levels of finance, we talked about the 100 billion, which has been promised for years. Developed countries have to deliver on this, and it's a drop in the bucket for what we need. Even for the nationally determined contribution for Rwanda alone, it's over $10 billion. Because what we have to talk about is the transformation of these systems. And then the third thing I want to talk about is this idea of behavior change and how, and the question to how people get involved in this. One of the things that we did a vote last year called the People's Climate Vote, and 2/3 of people in the world think that climate change is a global emergency. And we asked them, well, how do you want to solve it? And the top 4 were protecting nature, renewable energy, climate-friendly farming, and green jobs. It is so important that people start to pursue these things. We need small and medium enterprises. We need entrepreneurs. We need systems that can help get these businesses off the ground to feed that transformation and to address this emergency as it needs to be addressed.
Thank you. We are so over time, President Calderon.
Yeah, well, first, I believe that we are out of time to reach the limit of 1.5% of increase. Honestly, we are out of that. It's impossible. And we will need definitely the use of technology, either carbon capture, maybe these sophisticated things between the whales and the refrigerator. I don't want to get into that. But we need technology. We need to bet on that. Third, go with the politically correct speeches and blaming, go with that. That is not fixing the problem. That is not changing political will. That is not taking the decision. We need to have more pragmatical approach. I don't know, what is it? Maybe we need to pay for something money associated with carbon emission, either reduction or sequestrations. I don't know. But instead to say, give me this 100 money, give me 10 money, we need to think about what is the measure, the tons we need to remove from the atmosphere, the tons we need to avoid, and we need to put a price on that. We need to start to work in a very pragmatical approach, because changing in human behavior could be coming from somebody preaching, consume less than that and that and that, or from economic incentives as well. And that's the other point we need to do. We need to tax carbon in a normal, not wartime, by the way, but we tax carbon and create the economic incentive that can change the behavior of the people, the countries, and the consumers. And finally, 2 things. Coming from a bottom-to-up approach, 2 things. One is do something. Yes, press in the public opinion, push a lot, mark whatever you want, but do something. So I choose to work in a very specific area. Now tourism is 10% of carbon emissions, 10% of jobs, 10% of GDP global level. We need to reduce carbon emissions. That's the reason we are working in the Global Sustainable Tourism Center. Maybe we can go, we can guide, we can support, and that could be a good approach to bring money from the rich countries to developing countries, to the poorest nations in a very pragmatic approach. And finally, be politicians. The only way in which we can this completely absurd political systems is with new politicians and new politicals. So stop blaming, or no, continue blaming you want, be your own politicians. And finally, never lose the hope. Sometimes I really feel I lost any hope about the future. Never do that. Keep your hopes, keep your dreams, and fight for them with all you have in your heart.
The last word to Dr. Susan Chomba, and I think you had a question for you as well.
Yeah, so on the question of adaptation finance, estimates currently is that developing countries need at least $70 billion per year for adaptation. But still, as Cassie mentioned, if you look at whole systems transformation, that's still a drop in the ocean. Let's also remember, as we have, greenhouse gas emissions continue to accelerate in the atmosphere and global warming continues to accelerate, the cost of adaptation also keeps going up. So for instance, it's estimated by 2030, we'll be needing at least between 140 billion to about 300 billion US dollars a year. So the figure is not going to be constant. It depends on what we are doing in terms of really limiting greenhouse gas emissions and accelerating, transformations in our system. So they are there, but there's so much that money can be used for. In WRI, we have this very sort of a structured framing on what we need to do around the natural ecosystems. Protect natural ecosystems. So protection of especially primary tropical forests, which are rich reservoirs of carbon, and as well as peatlands in places like Congo Basin and in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. You have areas that you have peatlands. If those peatlands are basically destroyed, the amount of carbon that is going to be released, it's going to take hundreds of thousands of years to ever get it back, even if you're talking about trying to restore them. So secondly, so you protect natural ecosystem, restore degraded lands. As I mentioned, in Africa, we have huge potential in other areas on the tropics for restoring degraded lands. When you restore degraded lands, you're improving soil organic carbon, you're improving above ground vegetation carbon, and above that, you're also looking at sustainable food production. Thirdly, reduce food loss and food waste. It's amazing how much food loss and food waste happens both in developing countries as well as in developed countries. And food loss and food waste, if it were a country, it would be third after US and China in terms of the amount of emissions that comes from food loss and food waste. It is also incomprehensible that we can be having significant amounts of food that is being lost and wasted, while at the same time we are talking about millions of people going hungry. It sort of doesn't make sense. So I think we are caught up in a world where we are constantly trying to increase food production, exhausting our land, going into natural ecosystems, and at the same time, most of that food that is being produced, at least a third of it globally, is going to waste.
That's an excellent message, Susan. I'm going to have to interrupt you there to end on, because I do think that kind of upside-down world of talking about security and scarcity, while at the same time, huge amounts of waste is something we should all go away and think about, while also considering running to be politicians and trying to stay hopeful. I would like you all to give a huge round of applause for my panelists, and thank you for being so engaged.
I want to see the paper.